What's up everyone, my name is Rosendo, welcome back to my channel. We are back with another video. Today we're doing something a little bit different. I know I said I would be putting out one video a week. We're trying to keep that streak up. So I have a lot of ideas that I'm just doing, some fun ones, some creative ones. Last video was a concept based one. Today's a fun one. Today's a not so serious one. Today we're going to be taking a look at my discography and making a tier list on my releases up to this point, which is January 2025. So all my 2023 releases and all my 2024 releases. Now, I think this is a great point to take a look at some of my old tracks because a lot of things really led up to that Expression EP. So I have a lot of things that I'm working on now, but this is a pretty big benchmark in my discography that I think it makes sense to go back and maybe at this point critique some of my old tracks. So without further ado, let's hop into the tier list. All right, we are on Tier Maker today. Now, just real quick, I love tier lists. I think they're a great way to just get any point across, whether it's you're rating, songs, tracks, whatever, artists, whatever it is. I'm a really big fan of tier lists, so this will not be the last time you'll see a tier list on this channel. But that aside, I just want to mention a few things before I start. Number one, I said this is a good time to take a look at my old tracks and critique them, so that's one of the things we will be doing. Since I'm a very different producer than I was when I was making, let's say, something like this, my Fake ID remix. So it's a good time to talk about some of the things I like about these tracks, some of the things I don't like about these tracks, maybe some of the things I would have done differently. It's a great time to do that. Number two, quick disclaimer. Of course, these are my tracks. I'm going to be subjective, but I will try to look at these as objectively as possible. I have my preconceptions on what I think makes a good track and my opinion on what makes tracks, stand out, what makes them interesting. So that will play a role, but I'm going to try to look at these as objective as possible. I'm not going to be too harsh on myself. I'm not going to, really take a critique's point of view of this. No, but I am going to look at them a little bit objectively. I'm going to take a little bit of a step back, but yes, I'm going to be subjective. I'm probably not going to put any of my tracks on D tier. But that's just one of the things I wanted to mention. And finally, number three, the hardest part about this is it's going to be hard to take into consideration mixing. I mean, if we took mixing into consideration, these would probably all be D tier. Maybe not some of the newer ones, but some of these older ones would probably all be D tier. I've talked a lot about how my mixing skills have improved and how sound quality has changed drastically in my tracks. So if that were something we're taking into consideration, if we're taking into consideration mixing and sound quality, yeah, that would definitely put a damper on things. So we're not really going to take that into consideration. That being said, I do think that mixing and sound quality is an important factor to take into consideration when you're rating these tracks. So I'm not going to ignore that completely. I probably will take that into consideration, but I'm not going to, be super harsh just because something like, let's take Express. Something like Express has very bad mixing versus something like Journey Beyond doesn't. So I'm not really going to be looking at mixing, but I'll take that into consideration a little bit. Other than that, you guys will see how I go about this, how I go about rating these tracks. And again, this video is just for fun. I love tier lists. This is a good time to take a look at my old tracks. So we're going to be making this just for fun, to have some fun, to talk, to tell you a little bit about why I like some of these tracks and some of the things I don't like about them, and just kind of put them in a tier list. All right, so let's get straight into it. We're going to be going in order. I will say one of the nice things about having your own tracks is I can play them in the background of these videos without any worry about copyright because I made these tracks. And the other thing is I'll try not to ramble on too long. I know I can ramble on quite a bit in my videos. I'm going to try to keep these a little bit shorter. I'm not going to talk for 5 or 10 minutes on one track. Maybe I will. I can't say that yet for sure. But I'll try to keep it pretty short. All right, starting with track number 1, Fake ID Rosendo Remix. This is the first track I ever released. It's not on Spotify. It's on SoundCloud. It is a tech house remix of Fake ID by Written and Kahlo. So again, I've broken all of these tracks down, by the way. I've broken up from this track all the way up to Release. Actually, Call belongs over here. All the way up to Call. So there's track breakdowns on these first tracks. I made an overview of my EP. I've not broken down any of these tracks. But if you want a full breakdown and really specific details on these tracks, you can go ahead and check out those videos. But where I was going with that is Fake ID Rosendo Remix. The first track I released, it was meant to be a house track, something very listenable, of word I've used in the past, something for, to dance to just for all populations, not as expressive, not as creative as these other ones. So this is a pretty normal track. Intention, expression, progression, the 3 characteristics I talk about, pretty much all the things I'm going to be taking into consideration when I rate these tracks. I know I mentioned probably in this video that expression and intention are weird because expression is a form of intention, but that doesn't mean that your intention always has to be expression, things like that. So Fake ID doesn't have any expression, definitely has its form of intention, in the progression and keeping the emphasis on the vocals and playing with the rhythm that way, all sorts of things. But now I'm getting carried away, so let's talk about where I would rate this in the tier list. All right, so let's see. Let me think about this a little bit, because Fake ID Rosendo Remix definitely isn't the most. I mean, I talk a lot about expression, and just because this track doesn't have expression, that doesn't mean it immediately deserves to go D tier or something. I still wouldn't place it as high, not because it's a bad track, because it doesn't have expression, but because I am an artist who believes in the principles of expression and intention, and especially expression, and making your music with reasons and sometimes even with emotions. So the fact that it doesn't really represent who I am in that sense, I think knocks it down. That doesn't mean I think it's a bad track. Maybe it's actually not a bad idea to place it just straight up in the B tier, because it's a decent track that has, a solid sound, good vocals and all that stuff. If I were being harsh, I might even put this in the C tier, but I'm not going to be harsh on myself. The biggest reason I'm not putting this in the C tier is because even though the mixing probably isn't the best, it's not as bad as the other tracks. And I talked a lot about that in Exposition and probably over here as well. The mixing isn't that bad because there weren't that many elements to actually be mixed, so the sound quality isn't all that bad. If it were bad and I want to be a little bit harsh, I could put this in the C tier, but because the sound quality isn't horrible, I think this is a good B track. B tier track, good, solid track, not a lot of expression, so it doesn't represent who I am as an artist, doesn't even represent my sound all that well either. But that's okay, because I made this track and I made it for a reason. I had my intention in making it. So solid B tier track, I'll say. All right, next we have Low. Now Low is a very similar track as Fake ID, not because it's a tech house track, but because it's a house track. And B, it was also meant to be a little bit more listenable, although it's a little bit more minimalistic. It's a little dark. Again, I've talked about all these things in the track breakdown, so I don't want to talk about them too much, but I can't help but mention them a little bit. But yeah, Low is the first track that I released on Spotify, pretty much marks the beginning of my discography on Spotify. And if I were to rate this track, I'd probably also put it on B tier. I like the kind of the mood of it. It's a little dark and a little bit mysterious. I like that's minimalistic, and I like that it draws attention to patterns more than anything, because as I've mentioned many times before, I'm not big on sound design. I'm big on intention, expression, and I like arranging things. I like patterning things out. I talked about that in my 1 hour challenge. That's what my favorite thing to do. So when we're looking at the patterns, when we're looking at how this track changes, how this track kind of starts from something very basic and just gradually moves its way up and adds a little bit more groove every time, I think we can place this B tier. Again, mixing isn't all that bad in this track either, so I'm not going to knock it down for that. All right, now Exposition. Now this is where it gets interesting for two reasons. Number one, this is where we kind of get into the heart of my sound and my discography. And number two, this is where the mixing just takes a turn down. I've already talked about that. So this is going to get a little challenging. Now Exposition, if you saw my track breakdown, again, very much an introduction, an exposition into who I am, into my sound, into the sounds I like, into the type of music I want to make. I don't think I can go any lower than A tier on this track. I really like this track. Now the sound quality might not be the best, even in the sense, actually there's a reason I could knock it down, but I'm not going to. Even in the melodic sense, there's not that much going on there. It definitely is just meant for you to focus on the sound and the environment and kind of the vibe of the track, which is the type of mood and vibe I'm trying to establish as an artist. So because this track doesn't have the same melodic progression as something like Empty and Alone, as something like Progress, as something like Journey Beyond, which I've talked about before, I don't think it belongs in S tier. I wouldn't say it's an S tier track. And if it were an S tier track, the mixing would probably just knock it down. But I don't think the mixing deserves to knock it down to a B, because again, it still establishes everything I wanted to establish. It still carries it carries a ton of intention and expression with it, and the progression is rather nice. But I think the progression is nice on all of these tracks, except for case chords, but I talked about why in my expression overview. So when we're looking at intention and expression, very big on intention, pretty big on expression as well. Mixing might kind of impact it a little bit, but a solid A tier track if you ask me. All right, next we have Express. Express is probably the only track on here. Well, there's another track on here, but Express might be the only track on here that both defines my sound, that has intention and expression, that I might be willing to put into B tier. Now, I'm subjective, so I'm not going to do that. I'm definitely going to put this A tier. You know what? I'll put a B tier. But now I don't think these are in any particular order. I mean, I could do that. So let's just put Low over here and Express over here. There would need to be like an A minus tier, and it's not moving. Let's do this. There we go. There would need to be like an A minus tier. I'll be harsh. I'll put Express on B tier. Now, still has the intention, still has that drum and bass sound that I wanted to get creative with. That was the big one with Express, actually. It was defining my sound after, it was a follow-up to Exposition. It was defining my sound and taking the same elements and the same expression and the same intention, but showing that you can do the same thing, but in a genre like drum and bass, which I actually really liked. I liked the intention aspect of that. It definitely had the expression in the same way because it was just meant to carry over my sound, you know, the super saws, the melodic elements in drum and bass. So I think this is still a nice track. It's an important track. The reason I'm going to knock it down 2 points is there's a reason I'm putting it in a B instead of A. Number one, the melody and the melodic progression isn't really there. I mentioned this before. It's not really as prominent as it is on some other tracks, and I'm starting to realize that's something I do want to take a little bit more seriously moving forward. So that's something that I can reflect on now as a producer and realizing, you know what, some of the tracks that I really like are big on melodic progressions, like Journey Beyond and Twilight and Empty and Alone. These are some of my favorite tracks. And pretty much the only difference between these 3 tracks and the other tracks in the EP and something like Exposition and Express is the melodic progression. It really lies there. So I'm starting to realize now as a producer that that's something I really want to focus on instead of just the sound and the progression and the track and the intention. The melodic elements make a big difference as well. So because Express doesn't have the same attention to the melodic elements, although it still has melodic elements, it still has that melody to it that exists. It's there. It definitely exists more than it does in Exposition. It's just not as prominent and it's not as impactful on the track as it is in some other tracks. So that's the reason I'm willing to take it from an A to kind of like an A-. And again, I mentioned I will take mixing into consideration. I'm not going to base everything on mixing or else half these tracks would be in D tier. But I will take mixing into consideration, and it's a little bit of a harsh track. The mixing isn't quite there. I could have done a lot better. Well, at that moment, I couldn't have done any better. Now I can do a lot better because I'm a better producer. So A tier track, but because the melodic progression isn't quite there and the mixing is suboptimal, I'm just going to put it in B tier. I'll be a little bit harsh. I'll put it in B tier. Other than that, let's say the mixing were perfect. If the mixing were perfect, I could probably put this A tier because even though it doesn't have quite the same melodic progression, it's still a nice track. It still has all of the elements that I vouch for, and it's not like I'm putting it in S tier. All right, now moving on, we have Progress. So this is a tough one because just running through this in my head, I think this could either go A or S. I don't know if I want to put it in S, but it has such a unique intention that that I really like this track, and it's hard for me to be objective about it. So real quick, the whole point of Progress is the track is called Progress, not Progress, but it's actually a 2-in-1 title. It's called Progress and Progress in my head, which is already something I really like about it. But the whole point of Progress was to demonstrate progression in a track. That's why I named it that. It was to demonstrate how tracks can progress in the purest sense, where you start with just chords and you take it all the way to a drop, bring it back down, take it to a drop again just to bring it back down. It starts straight off with a BPM, which I've mentioned before, actually in short form. Short form is just a clip of my long form. So I mentioned in Call that having a little bit of a vague rhythm to start the track is always a nice way to introduce progression, but the fact that Progress just gets straight to the BPM and establishes 128 and still demonstrates progression, I think is really nice, and I really like that part of it. And the other part was, it was just to demonstrate my progression as a producer and my progress as a producer and how much better my mixing skills were. And I talked a lot about that in the video, and I talked about why that's the case. And then in Call, I pretty much leveled up again, because the interesting thing about Progress is I actually think it's mixed very, very well. It just needs compression. I didn't really know how to use compression at that time. So I leveled up again in Call. But the point is, from Express to Progress, I really leveled up as a producer, and it demonstrates my progress as a producer as well. It has the 128, the melodic progression is there, the track progression is there. I just really like this track. The only reason I don't think it's, top of the top is because it doesn't quite carry the expression as the other tracks. So again, this is one of those areas where intention and expression can differ, because it has intention in all the things I just mentioned, but it doesn't have expression and the same feeling and the same emotional weight as something like Journey Beyond, Empty and Alone, Release, even Twilight, and actually pretty much everything out of my Expression EP, which is why I call it Expression. So it doesn't have the expression, which is why I don't think I can put it at S. I want to save S for kind of the top of the top, which is just what I do in general, not just in my discography, but in anything I do, I will only put S at the top of the top. For example, there are a lot of albums I really like. You know what, maybe one day I'll make an album tier list, but I would need to re-listen to a lot of albums, and that would just take so much time. But there are a lot of albums that I really, really like, and out of I don't know, 10 or 15 albums I really like, only 2 of them would I put at S, or maybe the point is only a few of them would I put at S, the rest I would put at A. So Progress, it's going to have to be A tier. Yeah, I don't think I can put it at S. It doesn't have the same kind of the expression. It doesn't check off all the boxes. It checks off the boxes in a few boxes in a really, really nice way, but it doesn't check off all the boxes. And because of all the things I mentioned, I'll probably put Progress over Exposition, but you can interchange these. Again, they're in no particular order. This one, I could probably see this order. A tier in no particular order. All right, now we have Release. And out of all the things I mentioned, it's funny because I just mentioned that I would only save S for the top of the top, but I might have to go S on a Release. And Release is just such a meaningful track to me. There's nothing I haven't said about this track already. There's nothing I can say about this track that I haven't said already in the track breakdown. Why it's so meaningful, why it's important, and then all the things about why I made it, why the progression is nice, all those things. Yeah, this is like an S- track for me. And even if the mixing were perfect, which it's not, although it's not horrible, and it doesn't quite have the same melodic progression as some of the other tracks, but it was never meant to be about the melodic progression in this case, so I'm okay making an exception here. Although maybe actually that's not true. It has melodic progression in the vocal chops. I'm completely wrong. I'm completely wrong about that. So even if the mixing were perfect, it doesn't have the same emotional weight as some of these tracks I really like, but it still has the expression in a different way, and it still has emotional weight. It just doesn't have that kind of dark and futuristic and, as I mentioned before, Porter Robinson Worlds type feeling. It does, but it has that Porter Robinson feeling, but in a different way, in a kind of a little bit more euphoric way, not in a Sad Machine Divinity type way. But now I'm getting carried away. I still think I might just have to go S. I actually completely forgot about the vocal chops. Whenever I think of this track, I think of the first, just the second the drop hits where the supersaws really hit you. But I forgot that the vocal chops are definitely a thing that introduce a melody. So on that note, it has the melodic progression as well. So it pretty much has everything. It has the melodic progression, it has the intention, it has expression, it has progression. Mixing is not perfect, but I'm not going to be too harsh on the mixing because it checks every other box. I just made it a few months too early. So I think I'll go S. S- tier would be appropriate here. And then of course you would have S-, S+. So that would be a thing, but we don't have that here. I have to go S here. I have to go S on Release. All right, moving on to Call. Now, Call is an interesting one because I just listened to it again for the first time in a while. Not today, but I think a day or two ago. And it made me realize that I actually do really like this track. If you asked me 3 days ago, I would have said, hey, I like it. It's a good track. It's a solid track. It's not a great track, but now that I listen to it again, I think, man, this is a great track. It's not a perfect track. It's not an amazing track, but I think it's a great track subjectively. And it doesn't quite have the expression. It doesn't have as much intention. It has intention, but not in the way that I like my tracks to have intention. Although it definitely has intention. So I can't really say too much about, checking all the boxes. But the mixing is there. That's one thing that's absolutely true. Actually, the mixing might even be better on this track than it will be on some of these other tracks. It's probably better than Intro, maybe a little bit better than Betrayal. Twilight is a strange one, so we'll talk about that one in a bit. But the mixing is there. It has the qualities I like. It has vocals for the first time. This is actually the only track that I've made that has vocals out of Splice, if you haven't seen the breakdown. And Release had vocal chops. Well, actually, Fake ID Remix had vocals, but that was a remix. So Call is a harder one. I actually have no clue where I want to put this. So let's just work our way down. It's not S. I think it's just going to end up being at the top of B tier because it just doesn't quite have the characteristics that, Expression and Progress have. I mean, just looking at these, I can say that I don't think Call quite lives up to these two tracks. But I can maybe put it at the top of B tier. The mixing just knocks down Express a little bit too much. That Call might go above it. Again, in no particular order, but maybe in this order, maybe Call could be above Express. They're actually both drum and bass tracks, so they're very easily comparable. But Express definitely has the intention and the expression. Call just kind of has the intention and only some of the intention. It was still made with intention, don't get me wrong. I make every decision I make with intention. But intention and expression in the other way where Express was kind of meant to demonstrate something. Call wasn't really meant to demonstrate. Actually, that's not true. Call was meant to demonstrate something. It was meant to demonstrate just drum and bass and kind of what you can do with vocal samples. And I talk a little bit about that in my breakdown. And I actually completely forgot about that. But just because it demonstrates something doesn't mean it's revolutionary in the way it does it, which I think is the case with Call. It demonstrates something in a good way. It doesn't demonstrate something in an amazing, groundbreaking, wow, this producer is doing some game-changing things type way. So I think that's one of the reasons why we'll probably just leave Call B tier. I still like the track. I still think it's a great track. But you know, it just doesn't really quite live up to A, my sound, which I've mentioned in kind of these two tracks, and B, just the other elements that these tracks definitely have. All right, and now we finally made it to my Expression EP, actually intro, and this is a little bit organized wrong. There we go. So now we finally made it to my Expression EP, and we can talk about these tracks. Now I might just have to fly through these a little bit quicker just because I've already just made the overview, and because I made an overview and I didn't do a deep dive on each track, if I did an overview right now, it would just be repeating myself. So I can probably go a little bit quicker, although I do want to say a few words on each track as I rate these. So intro, nothing I haven't already said. I mean, just the theory behind the track and the intention behind the track makes so much sense. And especially when you watch the video and when you think about these things, you think, wow, this is actually a pretty, you know, pretty meaningful track. But the melodic progression isn't there. The mixing is definitely not there. It's probably one of the more mediocre mixing, although it's not that bad. I experimented with kind of changing the sounds when I was making intro, and I think, you know what, this might be a little bit too harsh. I should probably pick a softer super saw, but it just took the kind of the mood and the emotion away from the track. So that's why I like to cut this track some slack, because I remember trying to change the super saws and trying to subdue it a little bit, and it just took away from the feeling that I wanted to get across, which, just to remind you all, is kind of that winter cold air feeling. I made this track popped into my head when I was walking in the winter air at night. So I don't want to be too harsh on the harshness of the track, because I could have changed it and I didn't. That being said, it probably could still be mixed better, but that's not why we're here. So again, it's good to kind of critique these tracks a little bit, but we're here for a tier list. So where would I put this on the tier list? All right, now right off the bat, I don't think any of these tracks can make B tier. Expression's just such a meaningful EP. It checks pretty much all the boxes. There's a few the boxes that some of these tracks don't check, like mixing and melodic progression. Other than that, the expression is always there, the intention is always there, and just the emotion and the sound I'm trying to portray and get across is always there. So it's just gonna have to be A tier on all of them, and I guess I could just go faster. Well, maybe some of them will be S, and I guess I could just go faster and put all these in A tier and call it at the end of the day. But maybe we'll order these. We'll order these. You can maybe flip-flop these two around, but let's order my Expression EP. All right, now I probably should have done this earlier, but I already talked about which ones I would put A+, which ones I would put A-, so I'm not going to rearrange these right now. Let's just talk about my Expression EP and have an A, an A+, and an S- tier, and an S tier, but then it's hard because the release doesn't really belong in S, and then all that. We're gonna ignore that. Let's just do this instead. Let's have an A, an A+, and an S, because S, we would have an S and S-, but we're not going to pay too much attention to that today. It doesn't matter. But we are going to have an A and A+ tier just for my Expression EP, just so I can distinguish the difference between some of the tracks I like and some of the tracks that I like less. All right, so starting with intro. Intro probably is an A tier track. I don't think it belongs in A+, just because of the mixing. Mixing would probably knock it up. Actually, no, you know what? I take everything I said back. The intention is just there. These are just all A+ tracks. I just need a tier to put these outside of the other tracks I made. Yeah, this is actually pretty hard. All right, whatever. Again, it's just I can't be objective about these tracks. These other ones I can be a little bit more objective about. Intro I can't be all that objective about. Anything out of my Expression EP I can't be all that objective about. So it's gonna be A+. Now you know what? I think I do need an S- tier, because I don't feel bad putting this in A+, but I would feel bad putting it any higher. These are just all A+ tracks. Video ends here. No, we'll talk about them a little bit more, because there are tracks that maybe I just need to just do the rest of the tracks, and then I'll realize that intro is a great track, but it's not as good as some of these other tracks. For example, Empty and Alone. Empty and Alone just goes straight into S. Now, I talked a lot about this track in my track breakdown. I talked about why I think it's probably the most important track, in some ways the most important track of the EP. Intention is there, expression is definitely there. Melodic, it has the melodies. The mixing is actually pretty good. The mixing's not all that bad in this track. It's there. The sound I want to portray is there, and the sound and the mood I want to portray is there, probably the best way out of all the tracks out of the EP. So Empty and Alone is just a no-brainer S, because of all the things I mentioned in the breakdown. Again, I can mention more, but the breakdown pretty much covers everything about why I think Empty and Alone is the primary track of the EP, or it can be seen as the primary track of the EP, kind of the headliner track of the EP. And for that reason, it just goes straight into S. Probably, I would even put this before release. Again, in no particular order, but if I were mixing this around, Empty and Alone, it goes above release pretty easily. Yeah, there's not much going on. There's a competition, but Empty and Alone, it's actually interesting now that I'm looking at these. This is where I get carried away, but now that I'm looking at these, Empty and Alone and Release are kind of two completely different ends of the sounds I want to portray. So it's actually nice to have these side by side because they're both S tier tracks in two different ends of the spectrum, but they're made by the same artist. They both have that super saw kind of sound in common. And even just the cover artwork right next to each other is a very interesting contrast in kind of the sounds I portray and the intention and the expression I get across. So just looking at these side by side is actually pretty interesting. All right, Betrayal. This is where I get to be a little bit harsh because then this is the part where I remind myself that I can't be objective about these tracks because I mentioned that Betrayal is, I don't even know where to begin. Well, let's cut to the chase. Again, I'm not here to talk about these tracks. I'm here to rate these on a tier list. I like Betrayal. I don't like Betrayal. I like Betrayal. I don't like Betrayal. Betrayal, the mixing quite isn't there, although the mixing isn't bad. Doesn't really have much of melodic progression, although it was never meant to be about the melody. And the sound it portrays isn't quite my sound, but it tells the best story, as I've mentioned, out of each EP, out of all the tracks. I think it tells one of the best stories, maybe if not the best story, out of all the tracks on the EP, which is why I can't just knock it down to something like B, even though my mind says B, my heart kind of says B. But I just can't put this track at B. It's part of my Expression EP, and the story it tells is just amazing. And I just need to remind myself real quick and remind the viewers that whole progression in the track of telling an emotion, sharing an emotion, and resolving it at the end, that is textbook my storytelling. I've worked on tracks before that I haven't released yet, that I don't plan on releasing maybe until a long time, because there's a lot of thematic elements that I need to not necessarily fix, but a lot of thematic elements I need to address. And to cut to the chase, there's lyrics to some of these tracks that I've written down that I wouldn't just need a singer. Then I don't feel like getting a singer. I don't know how to mix vocals, and I don't plan on releasing those tracks forever from now, so they're not really important. But they share a lot of the same principles as Betrayal. Betrayal is textbook me as a songwriter, portraying an emotion and resolving it. So because of that, I need to put this track high up. I can't put it any lower. Again, my mind and heart says B, but this is, in a lot of ways, and in the way, the first track that demonstrates who I am as a songwriter, sharing an emotion and resolving it within the same track. I mean, if you guys knew some of the project files I have in FL Studio, you guys would know that this is just the textbook example of that. Either way, we'll put it in A. I'm not going to put it A+. I think it just gets knocked down by too many things, but it's textbook me as a songwriter. All right, now we have Twilight. Twilight probably just goes straight into A+. Not an S tier track for one reason and one reason only. I don't think the mixing is there, in the sense that the more I listen to it, and I did this with intention, but the more I listen to it, the more I realize the mixing isn't there. So the hard part about this track is I did a lot of the mixing in headphones, and I didn't do a lot of the mixing. I didn't do a lot of car tests because I was doing 6 tracks at the same time under a semi-tight deadline. So I did a lot of my mixing on headphones and on my AirPods, and this whole EP is meant to be listened to on headphones. It's not something you're meant to listen to, when you're driving or when you're working out or things like that. It's meant to just sit down and really take a listen to, which is how I like to listen to my favorite albums. So I haven't listened to Twilight in headphones in probably ever, and the hard part is Twilight is meant to be made during a drive. That's not the point. The point is this. The point is, when I was mixing it on headphones, I really heavily compressed this track with intention. I wanted it to be pretty heavily compressed. I wanted that drop to hit you. I'm thinking in retrospect, what I could have done is just heavily compress the drop and not heavily compress everything else. So I think there's a scenario where I might have changed, where in retrospect, in hindsight, I could change the mixing around. So for that reason, I'm not putting it into S. The mixing just takes it down a notch, just because I'm not quite satisfied with how I left that, when maybe I just think I need to give this track more time. Right now, I'm not satisfied. Maybe in the future I will be. It's an overcompressed track. It is what it is. That I cannot deny. It's an overcompressed track, and I made it that way intentionally. And I want to see if there's a world where that taste does grow on me. Right now, I'm really neutral about it. It's maybe slightly negative towards it. In the moment, I liked it, and on headphones, I like it. Listening to it in the car, I don't like it as much, but maybe I think I just need the summer to come in, right? Summer, windows down drive. I can't listen to this car right now with the windows down because it's winter, unless I wanted to and just make myself be freezing. But I'm just gonna give this track some time. I'm not gonna be too harsh on it right now on the mixing. It's overly compressed. It's overcompressed. Maybe I just need to give it more time. I don't know. We'll see. That's my only gripe with this track. Was what this whole rant was about. Great mood, great storytelling, great melodic progression, great elements. Again, I like the elements I chose, as I mentioned in the breakdown. It does a lot of things well. The only reason I have kind of a love-hate relationship with this track is just because of the overcompression, that I still can't decide right now if I like the decision I made at the moment or if I don't like it. I just haven't decided is the only thing. So A+ track, not S for that reason. Maybe down the line, if I think, you know what, I like the fact that it's overcompressed, it'll go up here. But even then, it doesn't actually, no, it probably would go up there. It doesn't have the same emotional weight as something like Empty and Alone, but everything else about it, even it has its own form of expression in the kind of Twilight feeling. Everything else about it is nice enough to probably put an S, but right now I can't quite commit to the S. All right, moving on to Case Chords. I think Case Chords probably just goes straight into the, I mean, my heart and my brain says A tier. I think they just go straight into the A tier because, before or after Betrayal. You can probably switch these two around. It's going to be after. Yeah, it's going to be after Betrayal, just because Betrayal has the storytelling in the best way. And now that I'm thinking about it, it has such good storytelling. Why didn't I put it in A+ tier? But I think A tier is fine. The melodic progression, all that stuff. But the storytelling is just too good. Maybe I was being too critical. Maybe I wasn't being critical enough. Whatever. Yeah, Case Chords just goes into the A tier. I talked about this track in my breakdown. I talked about how it doesn't really have all that much progression. It has progression, but it doesn't have progression in the same way that literally every other track you see here does. Maybe with the exception of Fake ID Rosendo remix, but that's a tech house track. Even Low doesn't have the same type of progression, but these are both house tracks. They're strange ones. But Case Chords is the only one here that doesn't have progression in the same way as any of these other tracks. So that's not really why I'm knocking it down to an A. I just don't think it carries the same intention and expression as other tracks do. I mentioned in my breakdown that every single one of these tracks was inspired by a piece of media, whether it be a movie or a TV show. And Case Chords really just takes, it just inspired, the TV show I watched just inspired some chords out of me. And for some reason, those chords flowed naturally into my DAW. And that was the essence of the track. That was the beginning, the foundation of the track was the chords. I just ran with the whole winter feeling track. I do think this has a really nice kind of winter kind of cold air, it's dark outside type feeling. But other than that, it doesn't have that much going for it in the expression, unlike something like Empty and Alone, Betrayal, Twilight. It doesn't have as much intention as Intro, which is why it probably doesn't measure up to that one. So I'd probably put Case Chords in A, although I do still really like the track. In the right context, in the right winter feeling, Case Chords I still think holds its own, but I think A is a fair grade for this track. All right, and finally we have Journey Beyond. If you already saw my track breakdown video, my EP overview video, you already know where this is gonna go. The only reason it's at the end of this breakdown is because it's the last track in the EP, so it's basically the last track I've released. I mean, this just goes straight into the S. There's no doubt about that. I mentioned every single reason why I think this goes into the S. In that overview, but because I mentioned a few of the kind of the criteria I'm grading these tracks on in this video, I'll mention it in the context of this video. Intention. Now that I'm saying this out loud, it has intention, but it doesn't have intention in the same way as some of these other tracks. It doesn't have the same intention as Empty and Alone. It doesn't have the same intention as Intro. And it doesn't have the same intention as Betrayal, which is why I'm thinking Betrayal could maybe be higher, because they had very specific intentions versus, to some extent, Empty and Alone, but that's a weird one. But versus something like Twilight and Case Chords and Journey Beyond, which were just inspired by, some element of it was inspired by the media I watched, but it doesn't quite have the same weight to it as some of these other tracks that I just mentioned. So the intention is there in the actual track itself, but it's not there in the same way as even something like, Progress or Exposition. But the reason I'm not knocking it down too much on intention is because even though the songwriting intention isn't there as much, the fact that it's a very long track and I made it a very long track just gave me a lot of room to make very intentional decisions in the track, in the progression, and all those things. But it definitely does a good job of demonstrating intention in a music production sense. So we're not going to knock it too much down on intention. Expression is a weird one because they go hand in hand, but it still has those expressive elements that I like on the fact that it's a little cinematic, a little bit orchestral. It has very long-term progression, so it still has a lot of the elements I like and expresses itself in that way. So I can't knock it down too much on expression. And as far as everything else goes, it's all there. Let's talk about some of the other criteria I mentioned. Melodic progression, there. Mixing, there. Progression, definitely there. Definitely the most progression out of all of these tracks. And with all that, when you take into consideration that the intention expression in this track really was the emphasis on the cinematic and orchestral elements that I really like, and the strings do a really good job as well. Journey Beyond just holds its own weight. And of course, the things I mentioned in the overview, I like the sounds I chose. I like the drops. One's normal, not normal because there's not a kick on the beat, but one's normal and one's halftime. So there's definitely, it has its variance. Again, because of the sounds, the pads, the emotion, everything else. It's all there with this track that it goes into S tier. Now, saying that out loud, do you put Empty and Alone? Do you put Journey Beyond in front? I think I'm more proud of Journey Beyond. I think it's a little bit more complex, but Empty and Alone has a little bit more emotional weight and intention to it. Not intention in the kind of the storytelling sense, but not intention in the production sense. Journey Beyond definitely wins there with, the 6-minute track moving up and down and all over the place with great elements and cinematic elements. So this is actually a good example to highlight that. It's a good example and a good time to highlight the differences in intention, where Empty and Alone has a storytelling intention. And by storytelling intention, I mean from the perspective of the songwriter, of the producer. Versus something like Journey Beyond, where it definitely has an intention on storytelling. I talked about why that is inspired by piece of media and how it's a whole journey, and it has that storytelling aspect to it, but it doesn't have a kind of storytelling from my perspective to it, like something like Intro, like something like Progress, something like Exposition, maybe something like Release as well. So it doesn't have that same storytelling element. But again, the reason I bring all this up is because it's a good place to distinguish between the two types of intention, and actually in this case, storytelling elements, where Empty and Alone tells the story of the, let's say the narrator, or in my case, the narrator is the producer. And Journey Beyond just tells a story that you're meant to listen to in the track. But the point of the intention is that intention from the producer, from the creator, and intention just in the decisions that you make in the track, which the whole point of the intention and the decisions you make in the track goes to show why these tracks over here are also important, and Release are also important, because there's so much intention that goes into each individual decision you make when making any one of these tracks, even Fake ID Remix, even Low, even Call. When making any one of these tracks, there's a lot of intention that goes into them, which Journey Beyond also has in its own. So again, intention there, it just looks a little bit different than here, but it has everything else. It has all the elements, and I really, really like this track. All right, and that is my final tier list. Again, there's a whole A+, A-, S- tier. There's a lot of nuances to these ratings, and I only added this A+ tier just to distinguish a little bit more between the tracks specifically in my Expression EP. So these are not hard ratings. If I made a hard rating on all of them, there would have to be S+, S, S-, A+, A-, and B-, and B+, and all those things. But also the mixing would play a role in that too much if I'm getting super specific. And my goal wasn't to look at the mixing too much, although you guys saw I took it into consideration. But I think this is a pretty solid rating. But again, this is just for fun. This is just me being subjective about my tracks and trying to take a step back, critiquing them a little bit. And this also gives me a time to talk about some of the elements, some of the things I like about these tracks, and talk about some of the characteristics I stand for in music production as a whole, and how they were present or if they were absent in these tracks. All right, but that is about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you guys have any questions or comments. Let me know if you guys agree or disagree where you would rate these tracks, if you would rate some of these higher or lower, how you thought I was on critiquing my own tracks, if you thought I was not harsh enough or too harsh. I probably wasn't too harsh though. I probably wasn't harsh enough. If you think I wasn't harsh enough, if you think I was too harsh, if you would have if you would have had different criteria based off where you rated them, or if this inspires you to do the same. If you're a small artist, if you're a big artist, it really doesn't matter. You know what? Maybe it's a good idea to have some fun with this. Maybe go to look at your own tracks and not only reflect on them, maybe even critique them a little bit and put them in your own tier list. Again, I love tier lists. I think they're super fun, and they do a pretty good job of just getting a concept just kind of displaying a concept clearly for a lot of people to see easily and briefly. Even if you didn't watch this video, you can see all these tracks and you can know immediately how I feel about all of these tracks. So again, if you're a creator, maybe not a bad idea to do some of the to do this for your own discography. You know, pick in the last few years, or maybe pick 1 year and rate your tracks and see where you end up. But again, that is about it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.